Boa tarde, good afternoon. I will continue in English, but I have a mother tongue and I felt the need to acknowledge it. Welcome to the second day of the Triennale talks. I'll give a very short introduction also for those who were not here yesterday. So following a tradition of hosting a public programs affiliated with the Architecture Triennale, I have had the huge pleasure and privilege and honor of being invited to curate the program of talks. And I did so in close dialogue and thinking with the curatorial investigation and thread of territorial agency, who asked themselves and ourselves this important question of how heavy is a city. And we took it from there, thinking notions of weight concerning both for weight as a form of contacts, as a possible relationship, but also as a pressure that can have quite damaging or complex effects. And thinking weight in relation to this question, we devised the program of the 3 days of the Triennale talks, according also to three main threads of investigation of territorial agency. And so yesterday we started with spectres. Spectres evokes notions of monsters, of something that is haunted, and that led us to discuss past and present in a continuing entanglement in which time is not that linear, relationship to forms of manifestations of empire and of colonialism, but also how they were fundamental to transform a mind and transform desires throughout the process of consolidation of modernity. And we continue today instead looking at the second thread, which is fluxes. And fluxes is, of course, an also ongoing temporality that continues the investigations of spectres to think about matters that move, matters that are in transit, that migrate, that question or are challenged by borders, that also contribute to think and hopefully redefine geographies and geopolitics. And therefore, the session of today will investigate how circulations, and therefore it doesn't make sense to define them between global and local forms of circulation, condition our lives, from forms of displacement to supply chains, and also to think how architecture can be a practice that engages with these fluxes as and allows them to understand as forms and potentials for solidarity and resistance. And in order to start our session, I'm very pleased to introduce the first of our speakers of tonight, and it's someone with whom I've probably never discussed fluxes so much and so seriously as with him. He's Andrés Jaque. Together, or I was invited to join the curatorial team that Andrés led for the 13th Shanghai Biennale, which happened across 2020 and 2021, and which was entitled Bodies of Water. And he was exactly looking at the geography of Shanghai and understanding how water was a fundamental vehicle for history, matters, humans, non-humans, and forms of infrastructure. And therefore, this encounter today couldn't have been possible without Andrés' presence. And Andrés is an architect and theorist. He's Dean of Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and he founded the Office for Political Innovation. Throughout his work, he has invited us through writings and projects to conceive architecture as a site of planetary negotiation. His practice expands architecture into an arena of coexistence, affect, and technological intimacy. In transspecies architecture, which we're going to learn much more about tonight, he will invite us to imagine design as a shared choreography amongst humans, minerals, microbes, and machines. Thank you so much, Andrés.
Thank you very much, Filipa, for this very, very generous presentation. And thank you very much, John and Sophie, for this amazing Triennale. And I'm so honored to be here with so many people also in conversation that I admire so much. I'm going to talk about transcolor architecture, but I want to make sure that I address the question of the Triennale and also what Filipa proposed, thinking of questions of weight in architecture and cities as inseparable from fluxes, from circulations, from transitions. When we look at this, it's really probably the end of a whole exploration about lightness in architecture. This is a photograph from Ivan Van of the Hudson Yards in New York City. This kind of, I would say, epitome of architectural collaboration with the unfolding of globalization and corporate power and hegemonies. And what I think is very unique is this shininess of it, that of course is inseparable from the production of this lightness. And this shininess is something that is taken to a very different step in the last 5-10 years by the use of titanium, oxide titanium, and not by chance the iPhones were advertised to the shininess of their edge, and the whole campaign was called Titanium. Titanium is what makes the vessel shine like this, and it's also behind the invention of the self-cleaning surfaces that applied on the ultra-clear glass with low iron produce this capacity. This is the titanium oxide molecular crystallization, and this type of very perfect assembly, one of the most perfect and smooth that is possible in industrial mineralogy, is actually something that is what makes possible that the particles of dust, the microbes, the fungi, the bacteria that would grow on the surface of the glass can be photocatalyzed and then wiped down by the rain. And that smoothness, this mineral smoothness that is produced at the level of molecules, at the scale of molecules, is inseparable from this other site in South Africa, Kolobeni, where the titanium is extracted. And extracting the titanium makes the sand very light. The titanium, as probably many of you know, it's a very heavy material that is found in the sand as little grains that retain the sand on the ground. When it is removed, the sand becomes very light, and then the whole area of Kolobeni becomes very dusty. So what I think is crucial is that the lightness, the shininess of Hudson Yards is at the expense of the volatility of the sand in Kolobeni, and therefore the dustiness of Kolobeni. The shininess of Hudson Yards, the corporate shininess of our iPhones, is at the expense of the dustiness of a place like Kolobeni, where farmers are seeing their trees dying, their lungs being sick and affected, and basically their communities being destroyed, dispersed, and forced to migrate to the cities. This is the tension, this transcolority is what I think is allows, from my perspective, to address questions of lightness now and heaviness. The heaviness, the lightness is transcolor, is distributed, is produced out of the tensions, the political tensions that are shaping our times. When we look at a project like this that we developed a few years ago, the Radio School, it's intended to give a response or to produce alternatives to this culture of shininess. And it's doing that through a very different way of composing diversity. If the heterogeneous is segregated, is distributed in different geographical locations through globalization and corporate power, there's also capacity for architecture to combine presences and bring together presences that are diverse. Sorry, I don't know where to. Is here? Yeah. This is the core facade that we developed for this project. It's something that took us 2 years. And it's a very simple thing, but it really, how to do that in a way that it doesn't crack, that it's made of many, many layers of cork produced in Extremadura in a way that actually doesn't damage the trees from where the cork is taken. And then it's grinded in different thicknesses, and it's mixed with natural resin in different gradients, in a gradient of densities of resin that allowed for the outer layers to be very porous. And what it was very important for us was how do we do something that is actually the opposite of this shininess, that is inclusive, that is hosting life, that is making it possible, even processes of eco-reparation. Knowing that the site of this school is a former landfill where the biodiversity is being affected by decades of sediments, of polluted sediments. This is actually what this place looks like. It's not an ideal, let's say, park. It's not a Pietudolf park or anything like that. It's, as you see, it's very, in a way, it's very poor. But this is 2 years after we built the building, and it's, as you see, there's already a few butterflies. There's actually a presence of insects that was not there before. Still, of course, as you see, very, very limited ecology, but one that was bettered by the presence of the school. The school is a school that is committed to John Dewey's tradition of pedagogy or pragmatism based on interrogating the present, interrogating how humans are situated in larger entanglements with ecologies, with histories, with political tensions. Ecology in the school is not, let's say, one of the courses, but it's actually the center of the entire pedagogy, which follows the Reggio Emilia tradition of self-education, where the building is considered a third teacher that needs to interrogate, to pose questions, to bring complexity to the daily experience. This is a detail of the SOM Leber House. And it's not by chance that it's drawn in this way with this black line, thin line on a white background, where basically the architecture that is intended is the first building with air conditioning, massively used air conditioning and ceiling and rubber ceiling, so that there would be a dream of doing an interior that would be hermetic. And of course, that was the time that New York City was building the new electric power stations in the areas that would be racialized to the presence of toxicity and where African-American population was forced to migrate. The migration of African-American population to locations that were polluted by the use of coal in the production of electricity is inseparable from the production of this ceiling of the office buildings in Midtown Manhattan, as Luckman, the architect and CEO of the Leber Company, this company that would claim that soap was making humans more pure, therefore better. And that sense of purity, that sense of cleanliness, is reflected in a building that was isolating the interiors from the dirty air that African-American population would be breathing in New York out of the production of electricity with coal. But it was, as Luckman said, this is a building that would prevent my employees from breathing the same air than any other New Yorker. This detail is very different to this. As you see, we're not using black lines or we're not sealing anything. Everything is porous. This is a construction detail of the cork facade of Reggio School, where there's a provision that fungi could develop their mycelius. The mycelius could allow for bacteria and others to grow. There would be an entanglement and a compositional approach to architecture rather than one politically compositional, materially compositional, ecologically compositionally, rather than the provision of a contained space like the Leber House detail. Construction details, I would claim, are political assemblies. their socio-ecological compositions that are determinant or at the side of political instances. What we see here is the possibility also to think in what is the relationship that systems will have. And from that point of view, I want to address the question that Filipa posed of the flows of buildings, not just as zipped up realities, but rather as nodes of entanglements. This is a sample of a little piece of the facade taken a year after it was built. What you see here is already the mycelius getting into, you see those little fibers? This is electronic microscopy technology. But you also already see these mycelius here, those little hair-like black things. The mycelius build what the fungi, what is called the fungi, what scientists, microbiologists call the mycelius, the fungi highway. They have a very little, they have the capacity to optimize a very thin line of water that is used by bacteria to get inside deep in materials. This is a scale up of the previous sample. We see here the mycelius, the kind of the roots of the fungi. They don't live long, as you know, and they could be reactivated, as Anna Singh explains us. Many of them are dead now. As you see, they're empty. The ones that are empty are dead, and that becomes the place where the first bacteria start running. You see these little balls there that you see inside the mycelius, the dead mycelius, these channels, and they use the water, the surface of water that is trapped there to get inside the cork. So they can get basically to the entire thickness of the cork, to the fungi highways. What is very interesting is how the bacteria start growing these biofilms that you see there, and they start putting their, so these little communities of fibers, by expanding the DNA out. You see how they build these communities inside the mycelius. This is a form of politics, compositional politics that I'm very interested on. And they construct these biofilms. These are all videos that we produced with Asunción del Ríos from CSIC, the Center of Scientific Research. And this is what is most interesting for me. This is exocellular three-dimensional matrix produced by the extension of the DNA, the projection of the DNA of bacteria, connecting one bacteria with others as a channel that allowed them to exchange and put out DNA, and even create a collective memory of their death that could be used in the future by other bacteria that could replicate and become and enact their DNA messages and even the memory that they accumulated there. For me, this is very exciting. And then it becomes a place, for instance, this matrix allowed for, this is algae, cells of algae that then can find the mechanical anchoring within the matrix and can even absorb part of the DNA and perform the information, enact the information. What I think that is very beautiful is that somehow, this is another example of another building that we did with this, is the Trans-Species Palace. What I believe is that when we think that this is a fundamental process, these mycelius, these bacteria, they end up repairing and reconstructing the ecology of locations like the landfill where the school is built. And there is a possibility of thinking of a different form of politics, that are not the spoken word, but is the composition, the alliance, the coalition between different types of life that they don't even have the capacity to sense each other. This is the Trans-Species Palace that it's now in the Triennale de Milan. It's a more advanced version of this. I want to say that I want to jump now to something that we did many years ago. I think around 2003 we started to work on this project. And we started actually looking at those stones there, these very refined stones that are sliced, polished, plastified, everything that ended up being building the relationship of architecture with extractivism is very much seen here. Actually, we could claim that the The Barcelona pavilion is nothing but a showroom of stones extracted from around the world, polished, plastified, so that they can be sold to those countries that could still buy beyond the limits of the Versailles Treaty, like those from the growing economies of Latin America, where cities like Buenos Aires are full of stones, or La Habana, that were commercialized through these channels. So this showroom has actually a lower part, this basement that I've been studying for many years now. And it's not by chance that the basement has played the role of making invisible the fact that stones break. And they keep breaking because there's many things that happen through them, as them, I would say. The water gets into their holes, and then it grows moss, fungi, to the extent that at one point the travertine slabs break, and they need to be repaired once and again, and repolished and cleaned again, so that everything is removed from them, all these forms of life. But the life comes back, and then they're broken again. In the same way that the pavilion needed, and this is something that I somehow am very emotionally connected with this little corner where Cat Niebla lived. And Cat Niebla was taken there because there were mice in the pavilion, and she was taken here to kill the mice. And it shows us that architecture, modern architecture, is always been a cosmopolitical construction. The cat was brought as part of the design to remove the mice from this cosmopolitical design. But what is interesting is that by being in the darkness of the pavilion, of the basement of the pavilion, Cat Niebla, who very sadly died through COVID, ended up developing atrophia macular, or macular atrophia, and became blind. When you see her eyes are a little foggy, and that's why she's called Niebla, fog. And that's the result of being part of the pavilion. So she was both designed and designing the pavilion. She was affected, transformed materially, cellularly, organically by the pavilion, at the same time that she was taken there as a cosmopolitical designer of the pavilion. This is something that obsesses me, and I've been writing about this cat for many years now, and I'm very happy that Circo de Ideas actually translating this book to Portuguese now, which I wish I could speak to you in Portuguese. But it's also a question about scale. I do believe that architecture needs to be considered it needs to be considered through its transcalarity, through how the cells in the eyes of this cat are inseparable from the fact that there's no mice in the pavilion, or the fact that the stone is polished and plastified, inseparable from the construction of global networks of circulation of minerals. And there's alternatives, and this is a book that Lucia Petroiuste, Marina Otero, and myself did with an amazing text from Filipa Ramos here. And this is also, so I'm trying to say that these are ideas that I've done with many others, through many others, in collaboration with others, and as Filipa said, through this amazing experience of the Shanghai Biennale, that Filipa Ramos, Lucia Petroiuste, Marina Otero, Yumi, and myself curated, that was specifically looking at these flows as the site of complex politics that could help us understand and operate within the time that we live in. This is something that, of course, I also have addressed as a design question. This is the trans-species kitchen that is using stones that were discarded from the stone industry and are intended to be brought back to the relationship with the earth, with the humans, in a form of cooking that is expanding our intestines as part of the ecosystems, and is through processes of fermentation is expanding the trans-species alliances that happen through the bacteria and the life in our intestines as something that is inseparable from the ground, from the earth, and the stones are also part of it. This would be the architectural document of these cosmopolitics that we're part of, how we dilute in them, and I would say that this is probably what the city looks like, I would propose, is this composition of very different things, but things that are producing collective togetherness, or togetherness where life is enacted, and that is basically, it brings the opportunity to change how we connect with others different than us, like stones, like minerals. When we look at the way stones have been introduced in systems of colonization, extractivism, human exploitation of human fellows, often we forget to look at the stone itself, the violence that was produced across the world by, for instance, European imperial powers that were extracting stone and bringing it to the center of Europe, or to particular urban centers in Europe, with the heaviness that that implies. We often miss that that violence happened through the stone itself, as the stone itself. The stone is as many non-modern cultures have reminded us, it's something that is alive. And there's so many knowledge about how stones are alive. The use of humidity and nitrates to activate the mineral, the biomineralization on the surface of the stone is something known by many non-modern cultures. The use of blood on the stone by the Quechua cultures, the blood, of course, containing high levels of saccharins and sugars and fat, activates many forms of bacteria that are capable of removing the nitrates from the air and purifying the air so that humans can breathe better as the stone itself is breathing and is breathing in attune with human bodies, is something that is lost for modernity but is known by others. This project, the Stone Life, that we presented in the last Venice Biennial, is a claim that we have to change the way we work with stones. And this is something that, again, goes down to the scale of what happens in the stone, which is, again, something that we cannot sense necessarily without technological mediations, but it's destroyed at the same time that humans are exploited by fellow humans and systems of coloniality and colonization unfold through the world. I think this is a call for us to rethink. This is what the stone looks like actually. It's alive, it's flowing, it's in permanent transformation, it's as alive as any other organism, but it's alive in a tiny scale and at a very slow path. These are images that we produce. So what I'm trying to say is that probably we're moving to a very different paradigm in which cosmopolitics are replacing cosmopolitics, body politics, politics where the composition of the heterogeneous can be understood as a site for new affirmations, is replacing the politics of the spoken word, the human-centered spoken word, and where the difference between the living and the inert is indistinguishable. Thank you so much.
Welcome back. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Tiago Patatas. Tiago is actually the representative of a younger generation of architects, big responsibility, from Portugal, who I had the huge pleasure of meeting and whose work I discovered through Marina Otero Verzier, who has also collaborated with the Lisbon Triennale. And some years ago, we invited Marina to continue a research that she was undergoing on lithium extraction across different contexts, and to come back to reflect about the area that is also her hometown, because she comes from Galicia, and to reflect about the impact of lithium extraction across the north of Portugal and the area in Galicia. And Marina asked very explicitly to be in dialogue and in research together with Tiago, and that's how we came to work together as well. Tiago Patatas is an architect, a researcher, and an educator. And he's very interested in the entanglement of landscape, technology, and power at the edges of Europe. His work gives shapes to a politics of geography grounded in listening and shared forms of endurance. And his talk will follow communities across the north of Portugal who are resisting lithium extraction, revealing insurgent forms of protection, belonging, and kinship with the land. Thank you, Tiago.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Filipa, for the generous introduction. Allow me just to extend my thanks to, of course, Anne and John, but also to the production team, Beatriz, Isabel, Ricardo, and Miguel, that helped us so much with the presentation, so thank you for that. It's truly a pleasure to be here today and in dialogue with so many who kind of deeply shaped my own trajectory, so intimidating indeed. For my contribution today, I thought, as Filipa said, I think it will be of interest to bring to the fore those who are on the front lines of a struggle not too far away from us in the north of Portugal that results very much from the weight discussed in this program. And I hope to shed light on how this pressure looks like and circulates, but also on what existential formations are being shaped in response to it. So I'd like to start with a seeming paradox. Under the so-called green transition, the expansion of extractive frontiers, or mines, are being redressed as a climate crisis mitigation measure. With this leitmotif, a capital-intensive logic has perpetuated trajectories of ecological dispossession in the south, while expanding its reach into new so-called green forms of extractivism in the north. Lithium, it's the most recent case in point. Simply put, the mineral is key in making rechargeable batteries, and these batteries play a very important role in both electrifying transportation systems and in renewable energy grids. But turns out the geopolitical relevance of lithium has been overwhelmingly motivated by the advent of the private electric car. And in turn, securing access to these mineral and others deemed critical has been reshaping the extractive agendas across the European landscape. With the European Green Deal and its narrow understanding of decarbonization, the focus has, in this context, been in energy sovereignty, that is, strengthening the supply chain security by extracting within its continental boundaries, while mining sustainably, which is, of course, an impossibility. And so is this one: economic growth decoupled from resource use. Economic growth remains indeed at the core of these policies that coexist with a continued reliance on fossil fuel consumption, especially at the industrial level, with other sources of energy being added to the palette of supply. It is really not a transition, but an energy expansion. Most recently, the militarization momentum in Europe has been legitimizing security as a way to bypass existing laws, scrutiny, and participation. This is maybe very much the opposite what Anne and John may call climate peace. So as corporate, governmental, and suprastate interests converge to impose geographies of lithium extraction, they do so with simplified environmental assessments, facilitated access to funding, and fast-tracking approvals of projects. On the ground, these dreams of green capital intersect violently with bodies, territories, and knowledges deemed of sacrifice. The Barroso region in the north of Portugal has been at the center of such extractive desires, where dozens of mining projects are planned. The Barroso Mine project, it's among the most pressing, here shown at the center in orange. Led by a company with no experience in mining, Savannah Resources proposes to carve the largest open-pit lithium mine in Europe. Its environmental impact assessment was rejected twice, only to be conditionally approved in a third attempt. we are yet to see those conditions being fulfilled. And this is what Romain would look like should the project proceed. Since then, several independent studies have highlighted the dangers of this planned project. The mining does not use the word dam, for instance, therefore it makes no considerations of dam safety standards, even though one can definitely see dams in the project as using a different wording. The project adopts cheap techniques that are rather dangerous, such as the upstream method of construction, prohibited in countries like Chile or Brazil. An air quality report highlights innumerable omissions of models and monitoring plans chosen to assess the pollutant dispersion. Just to give you some examples, the Aarhus Convention Committee, a UN body examining access to information and public participation on environmental matters, has ruled that the Portuguese state has failed to respect citizens' rights in the case of this planned mine. And probably most of you will still remember the resignation of Costa and the fall of the government in relation to a corruption investigation yet to be concluding, addressing these and other lithium mine, hydrogen, and data center projects. And yet, this mining project continues with a blatant disregard for long-standing life worlds, their modes of production and existence. These lands of Barroso have sustained relationships of coexistence for centuries. Collective land ownership, in particular, known as baldios, as these ones, along with the region's unique agro-silvopastoral system, were recognized as a world agricultural heritage by FAO, another body of UN, another layer of protection being disregarded. For nearly a decade, the population of Barroso have been firmly rejecting this unjust energy expansion and its violent implications. In 2023, this struggle took yet another shape when the mining company occupied communal lands illegitimately. Forced to react in defense of this communal structure, the population of Barroso organized to physically stop the extractive machines of savanna resources for more than 200 days. And in doing so, crucial lessons in social environmental organization and invention were revealed. In what follows, I'd like to unfold the topology of this 7-month-long blockade organized from the ground up. A number of accounts document the struggle, but not only. Part testimony, part oral history, they are granular testaments to the relations unfolding on these lands of common possession. They disclose the paradoxes of the energy transition and offer an alternative material account of how green extractivism is being imposed on and resisted by the life worlds of Barroso. Portrayed here, it's either farmer, cattle herder, an inhabitant of Covas de Barroso. She once told me that everyone knew that these lands were baldios. The condition of the soil, distribution of rocks, the inclination of the rain, the tree species in the area were all indicators of the communal nature of this territory. The elders, either continued, still remember planting those trees back in the 1960s. In fact, the story goes that while opening a route there during a particularly wet season, an excavator machine was stuck for days. Machines were once again stopped around the same location in November 2023. In her words,
temos uma pedreira que já vem desde 2006, que nunca foi explorada, e em 2017 começaram a haver movimentações dentro da área de contrato. Então, isto tinha sido em maio, quando começámos a ver aí movimentações. Quando foi no verão, foi quando a Kathryn telefonou a dizer: então, vamos ter uma reunião de litígio aberto, o que é que se passa em Copas? Eu disse: não sei, não faço ideia, se andam lá com os trabalhos lá no monte, mas não faço ideia do que seja. Ok, e soaram os alarmes. Eles começaram lá em cima, mesmo lá em cima já há lá um abuso porque os terrenos foram mexidos por onde lhes deu jeito, as áreas foram, pronto, as pessoas queimaram e marcaram porque quem fez estes trabalhos são pessoas que trabalhavam para a empresa, por mais que a empresa diga que não tem nada a ver, mas o topógrafo era contratado pela empresa, que na altura também vieram ter connosco, que se nós quiséssemos fazer medição do baldio, eles estavam disponíveis para nos ajudar e essas coisas todas, nós não queríamos nada a ver com eles, estava fora de questão. E foi quando começaram a descer. Um dia andavam aqui a cortar as árvores. Chamei a GNR e disse: isto aqui é particular e baldio, isto aqui não pertence à empresa, porque houve um senhor que vendeu um terreno daquele lado e marcou, com 3 hectares e meio, e marcou 6 ponto qualquer coisa. Ou seja, toda esta zona aqui até ali, é inclusive o tanque. E nós achámos, ok, como isto está em litígio, eles vão respeitar. Para nosso espanto, para dia 7 de novembro, estava aqui uma máquina, eu vinha para o armazém, vi aqui uma máquina a começar a trabalhar.
These were the almost 7 hectares of occupied communal land. In the words of Ida, one can distill how transformations occurring throughout time are registered through knowledge, inherited memories, and an attentive stewardship against aggression. Those who historically cared for these lands promptly initiated a legal complaint, as Ida mentioned, addressing the abuse by savanna resources, which was blatantly ignored by the mining company. So when the excavators reach the lands, their inhabitants act quickly to protect them, and so the blockade started. In these early days, Auric recalls having just arrived in the village of Covas do Barroso. Still deciding whether or not to stay, he made himself available for the initial days of the blockade. Much was unknown by then.
As semanas foram bem complexas porque, lá está, estávamos todos, de alguma forma, a ser confrontados com algo muito novo, que não... Eu tinha-me acabado de mudar para Covas em setembro, e então ainda estava, assim, no processo de criar a minha rotina e perceber como é que a minha presença mais a longo prazo ia ser em Covas, e muito rapidamente ficou claro, porque com a necessidade de ter, e a pressão, porque tornou-se mesmo uma pressão de ter sempre alguém presente desde as 7h30 da manhã até às 5 da tarde, mas sabes, começamos a chegar a um ponto em que eu nem precisava de alarme para acordar, porque havia aqui uma sensibilidade que, por muita exaustão que haja, se houver aqui um atraso, temos consequências imediatas. Muitas vezes chegavam cá com uma atitude de que a decisão estava feita que éramos nós, os criminosos, então haver uma intimidação. Eu comecei a experienciar essa intimidação de várias formas, não vou entrar em detalhes, mas especialmente não sendo daqui, havia, sabes, uma maior audácia de... Acho que para mim tornou-se ainda mais importante esta luta, porque criou muitos afetos a este verde, a esta paisagem natural, a este, sabes, durante 7 meses praticamente ver o nascer do sol todos os dias, de poder criar uma intimidade bem mais profunda, seja com a terra, seja com as pedras, seja com as árvores, com o vento, seja o que for, e com isso fica difícil ir embora, ou querer ir embora. Então, para mim, aprofundou o quão crítico é de haver aqui uma coletividade.
Auric's presence and sovereignty were often questioned as an individual both in transit and whose life has been in transition. And yet, his perseverance and growing network of support made him remain for the whole period of the blockade, eventually becoming one of its most pivotal figures. The lived experience made him want to stay, and he is now hesitant to leave permanently. There is too much to lose, he shared. Let us just linger for a moment on a point of collectivities that Aurik mentioned. For the blockade to remain firm, much needed help would come from different places. Some would come from Argentina, Spain, Germany. Others would arrive from surrounding cities whenever time off was available. Locally, the labor of protecting this territory never ended. Songwriting was a weapon to attenuate worries, but the eyes were always on the mountain, I was told. By this time, Elizabeth, an inhabitant of Romainho, a nearby village we've seen in the beginning of the presentation, was recovering from a leg injury. Not being able to walk, she made sure to contribute from a distance. She would keep an eye on savannah stocks in the London Stock Exchange. Every time a local disruption, a sizable demonstration, or a small victory was achieved, the stocks would go down, she described. But most importantly, she kept an eye on the blockade area, according to her.
Esses dias que eles deslocavam a máquina mais lá para cima, para a área que eles tinham lá de concessão, então aí ficava eu dentro de casa, ficava eu de vigia. Eu tinha rompido o ligamento do joelho, então não podia andar, andava com 2 canadianas e não podia trabalhar, estava em casa. Infelizmente, como eu digo, tenho acesso direto para o monte, conseguia dentro da minha casa ver a localização onde é que se encontrava a máquina. E quando ela se deslocava para o lugar do perigo, eu avisava os meus vizinhos para que fossem para o terreno para trabalharem a máquina. Daqui tenho a visão das 2 minas que querem fazer aqui do lado de Covas, que aquela montanha toda vai desaparecer, e uma parte da aldeia, e os terrenos de pastoreio dos animais. E também tenho da parte aqui, que é onde querem fazer outras 2, a maior, que aqui já a área de segurança a 50 metros mais ou menos, querem fazer as combreiras, deitar o lixo aqui para 70 metros, depois querem fazer outra lá abaixo, que é onde agora também está a zona da servidão, que eles querem fazer lá outra grande. Porque o ruído, a poeira, é tudo muito próximo e vai destruir tudo, vai contaminar as águas, os pastos. Quando vêm as poeiras lá da África, que toda a gente fala na televisão, que os carros, isto e aquilo, está tudo sujo. Eu aqui vejo as couves todas cheias daquele pó vermelho, todos os buraquinhos que as couves têm, está tudo cheio daquele pó vermelho. Depois vem lá de quilómetros e quilómetros e milhares de quilómetros, sei lá, não faço ideia onde é que aquilo fica, e ninguém consegue ter mão. Quanto mais aqui a proximidade que tem connosco. Foi uma luta muito grande durante 8 meses, mas conseguimos bloqueá-la e vencemos. Aquela fase nós vencemos.
These modest cabbages of Elizabeth become a sensorium within the struggle, able to accommodate scales as vast as intercontinental circulation. And an unexpected alliance with the Saharan dust, itself part of an ecological system heavily morphed by nuclear colonialism, allowed Elizabeth to foresee a brutally damaging scenario. But against all the odds, 7 months after, the extractive machine was forced to abandon its plans, and the blockade came to an end with a much-deserved sense of collective relief. Terrestrial and celestial bodies, mountains and dust, new lives and old knowledges articulated in the commitment to protect in the presence of these lands. However minor these recollections may sound, they offer, I believe, a potent antidote to the obstruction imposed by the so-called energy transition. Bringing these collectivities to the fore unfold a web of life against and in spite of green extractivism. To quote Jason Doublemore, humans make environments and environments make humans. In Barroso, much effort has been done to disconnect one from the other over the last century, and even more so over the last 7 years. But here, a grammar of common possession grounded on the baldios emerged as a fundamental constituent in the struggle. These stories also offer this image from within that brings both evidence and affect to the fore, offering resolution to the body on the land through kinship, be it a connection with a tree or wind, a note written during sunrise, or an affinity with distant dust. Together, they become this collective spatial biography from below, where agency is reclaimed not in Lisbon, not in the courts, but in the mountain, as an alternative way to govern and protect these lands. So these other possessions, kinship, governing, has a renewed lexicon for action in the face of green extractivism. This story does not end here, as you may imagine. By the time these testimonies were recorded, Aida, Elizabeth, Auric, and many of us were bracing for yet another wave of violence, as the incessant extractive desire remains aimed at Barroso through other national and European mechanisms. The excavators we stopped were but a small material extension of the existing modality of energy transition, which also includes European policies, lobbies, intimidation, corruption, logistical corridors, refining facilities, profit forecasts, among many others. And while a lexicon of action shall remain at the heart of the struggle on the grounds of Barroso, rejecting green extractivism requires that we continue the fight in these multiple registers and scales. Indeed, an anti-extractivist formation in the North, it's always incomplete. It's incomplete because it requires the locals and the other to connect. It requires the peripheries across the continent to align, to tackle overlapping forms of possession, and ultimately requires that these networks to be in alliance with those who have endured extractivism for centuries. In Barroso, the insurgency will certainly continue. After all, the region is named after the abundant clay, barro, used to patch holes in homes, yet another way to protect with land. So if it is in places like Barroso that the future of the so-called green transition will be ultimately decided, then we shall continue to force out extractive machines, to dismantle the energy transition's logic of abstraction, and to inhabit these geosocial formations of struggle and hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiago, and also thank you for making this polyphonic presentation in which you include the voices and the thoughts and the struggle of other people and bringing them here. And I'm happy to introduce our third speaker of the evening, Kathryn Yusoff. Kathryn is a cultural geographer and theorist, professor at Queen Mary University in London, and one of the foremost voices rethinking geology through colonial and racial histories. Kathryn writes from the depths of planetary time, where the histories of empire and extraction still move beneath our feet. In this talk, Architecture as an Earth Practice, Kathryn will travel from the Caribbean to Palestine and Lisbon to ask what kind of restitution can emerge from the ground itself. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organisers for bringing me here and the fantastic talks we've just heard. My PowerPoint slides are not going to be anywhere near as a geographer. I take a pass on that. So I want to talk about architecture as an earth practice, and to first of all put on some nearsighted glasses and then go back a little bit in time to think about some deep time arrangements. So I want to start off in the United Nations Security Council meeting on Palestine, and the Algerian UN ambassador Aymar Benjamin, who, as it turns out, was a school friend of Frantz Fanon, referred to those who draw their maps in blood. He characterized Israeli famine and genocide as an inhuman geography. He said, quote, "Our compasses point in one direction only towards legality and empathy to all of those who are suffering. already suffering from an inhuman siege. So Benjamin's retooling of the compass of compassion and its inversion, impunity, asks how geographers of violence that use the medium of earth, so the kind of weaponization of the earth, must be held to account for the weight of that suffering that they inflict as they dissolve cities into rubble. At the core of the reparative charge, he insisted, is a grammar, quote, justice to call them by their names and accountability to be held. So justice then must call through the noise and the dust, the rubbled and the disappeared, to ask how heavy is a city when it is built on the bones of racial injustice and settler violence? What are the shadow geographies of race through which a city is made manifest, not just in its origins, but in the ongoing fabric of its reproduction? When all colonial cities are bathed in the blood of those that have been taken with the gun, the Bible, coercive cultures, and ecological violences of colonialism, what weight do they bear and inflict upon beyond their borders and city limits? What heaviness does Brazil, Capo Verde, São Tomé, Madeira, Guinea, Macau, Timor bring to bear on any account of Lisbon? We've only got to recall the architectures, slave cities, settler cities, wharfs on the port trade in human flesh, castles with doors of no return, and the elemental genocide in Gaza now, to notice the role of architecture in stabilizing the relation between colonialism and the earth, where cities are the accumulation of that process of extraction, stabilizing the spoils. Building worlds of terror, and territory unbuild bonds of relation, forms of cohabitation, communication, and living across the living and the dead. All life and what it builds bridges geophysics, even those that proceed as if the earth was an externality that only becomes interesting in its commodity forms of metals and minerals. In the ghost geologies of cities, other geostories assert the interdependence of the inhuman and human, rather than seeing the dead as eliminated from the social realm. And so the dead call for reparative justice as the fabric of the earth remembers that which architecture often persuades us to forget. Decolonial resistance calls for a remembering of how ghost geologies rattle their chains, as Eduardo Glissant, the Martinique poet, might say of the submarine human occupation of the sea between the Caribbean. He reminds us that cities that are heavy beyond their unfathomable measure with the violence of their making. Tying together metals and imagination, Glissant comments, the first colonialists, Christopher Columbus, did not voyage in the name of country, but of an idea. The idea of finding the Indies and its fantasized wealth was so powerful to Columbus and the structures that produced him that he simply named the islands that he sailed in to the West Indies. The root of the idea was mineralogical. It was extractive. It was the idea of gold. The gravity of the idea of extraction pulled Columbus around the globe. It was a geophysics of sense that was achieved through, to quote Glissant, a displacement more eternal than apocalypse, end quote, where the fungibility of enslaved were made in the commodity form of the inhuman. As Sylvia Wynter comments, the modern world begins in the Caribbean in 1492 in genocide. In 1494, the Treaty of and I'm sure I'm going to pronounce this badly, Tordesillas, split the world in two by two meridians between Spain and Portugal, and it was signed in the Lisbon municipality. So the weight of colonialism is heavy, materially and physically. in its architectures of 3 foot and 3 inches, of the disassociation from Earth and the deformation of racialized subjects. In the Lisbon earthquake, we witnessed the shake of geology that made the Enlightenment subject as an agent of the Earth. Hopefully this won't bring back any bad memories. The geophysical shock of the Lisbon earthquake launched the fields of earth sciences and natural philosophy in the West and the geologic traditions we have inherited. At the time of the earthquake, Lisbon was the 4th largest city in Europe and the 3rd busiest port, and one of the wealthiest cities in the world from the traffic in enslaved persons and extraction of metals and diamonds from South America. So 850 tons of gold were sent to Lisbon from Brazil in the 18th century alone. And an estimated 2,000 enslaved persons arrived yearly from Africa from 1490 onwards. So European modernity was materialized as black and gold. The so-called colonial revenue of Brazil and the enslavement of first Moors, then Chinese, Malay, and Indian subjects was followed by the industrial enslavement of Africans. The colonial revenue of black and brown subjects built the public infrastructures and elaborated monuments and proto-scientific institutes of Lisbon in which the Enlightenment took place. The earthquake, tsunami, and subsequent fire disrupted the primacy of the civic and material functioning of Lisbon, and consequently Britain increased its trade in persons. Portugal and Britain together were the 2 largest enslaving nations, accounting for 70% of all enslaved Africans transported to the Americas. The earthquake was considered the first modern disaster since it generated a coordinated statewide and Europe-wide response to attend to the disaster, and it set in place architectural planning to mitigate future disasters. So the disaster became mapped into the governance of infrastructures and imaginations of urban planning as a sociality of risk and preparedness. It was claimed as a European geophysical event, despite its effect on North Africa. Disaster relief came from other European cities. There were refugee camps, and European media covered the event. So the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, sitting in Kronensberg in Germany, wrote his treatise on natural sciences from the newspaper clippings of the Lisbon earthquake. And Wolfgang von Goethe theorized from Weimar, and also Rousseau, Voltaire, for example. So the disaster is often seen as a turning point in the conceptualization of Western human history, where the attribution of natural history shifted from supernatural causation. So we go from God to natural causation of the earth. And the natural sciences became a field of seismology and scientific geology. So James Hutton, who's often considered the originator of modern geology, published his theory of the Earth in 1788, and Goethe and Kant all prepared theories of the Earth. So it was a real kind of moment of shock to the European sensibility of a dynamic Earth, but it was one that was underpinned by colonial history. So at a broader philosophical level, the earthquake highlighted how psychic foundations of the kind of fear of an inhuman planet were implicated in the combined mastery of matter. So God may have disappeared as the originator of kind of the material world, but man stepped in to replace that origination. So the Enlightenment subject, whose spatial practice was colonialism, becomes divorced from the earth under the white law of property. Architecture was part of the infrastructure in stabilizing the relation between colonialism and the earth. Cities were the accumulation of that process of extraction. Colonial strata had planetary taproots, and they express themselves in the built environment. And here are the refugees from the Lisbon earthquake. So we might think here about how that European sensibility was configured around refugees in our contemporary moment. So we will not cease to be in a world in which gold and various metals and minerals enfold subjects in dehumanizing racialized relation. The mantra of drill, baby, drill, which comes from the fracking fields of North Dakota, is manifest of the patriarchal extractive mode. The price of gold is at an all-time high. So we can see extraction as a colonial life form, a habitus, a genre of being human in its Western patriarchal form. It's a way of making power as the central weapon in defense of that colonial life form and its asymmetries of power geometries, so what we might call racial capitalism, which we see very much manifest in climate change in the moment. So extraction is a material, psychic, and geophysical process. Its trajectories of power and the cost of that power for those that work and live in the shadow of its geologies, next to the tailing dam, in receipt of the force of the hurricane, in the toxic afterlives of colonial geologies. So geology is a world-building and world-shattering process. It breaks, it unearths, it scandalizes the earth to build its monuments, buildings, and spatial enclosures. Building takes its place in the context of these historic paradigms of vulnerability to extraction and accumulation from extraction. So we can think about architecture as an earth practice that presents a double vision of both the earth and its imaginaries, a materiality and a geophilosophy. What heavy traces were left in the sea in Lisbon in 1755 as the earthquake shook the ground and loosened the stranglehold of the Portuguese trade in enslaved persons? What lightness arose in the defeat of the Portuguese by the Capo Verdeans, where Emilio Cabral declared from the flattened earth of Portuguese-induced famines in the 1940s and 50s, quote, "As for the mountains, we have decided our people have to take their place, since it will be impossible to develop our struggle otherwise. So our people are our mountains," end quote. So we can think about architecture as a clearing in the fold of extraction. And thus we might ask, how is it folded into imaginaries of materials and flows of the earth, as water, heat, construction, surface, aesthetic? As such, architecture offers a unique vantage point with which to reposition the axis of those sight lines that organize sites, but lines that are also sight lines. And I think this is something that, you know, when we think about decolonial practices, we tend to think about them as political geographies, but they are very much about environmental practices and environmental kind of philosophies for how to decouple from a colonial system and from being a colonial subject. So it's with this kind of view on critical cartographies that I want to just sort of finish this off. We're talking about the Venice Biennale that I was involved with as one of the curators, the geology of Britannic repair. And to say a little bit how this collective project answers some of these questions around reparations, but also around the kind of, to think about exhibitions as a space in which spatial relations are demonstrated and inhabited. So the national pavilions in Venice are these kind of relics to colonialism, but they are a kind of permanent built geography that makes a space to imagine and makes a kind of architecture of imagining into a kind of permanent condition. So it's from this kind of space of of a kind of neoclassical architecture that we really wanted to think about how you dismember the imperial map, how you allow all those subjects that caught in the corners of the imperial map some freedom in how they imagine the world and what those compasses of knowing might do to how we think about our material relations. So here's our team, Cave Bureau, Stella Mutogi, and Kabage Karanja, Owen Hopkins, and the Commissioner, Sever Davis, who's in the audience here. And we wanted to take the idea of an extractive vision, which is always a small vision, a vision that is based its value around the now at all costs, insatiation of extraction, and think with that smallness of vision to think about expanding the space of the pavilion, to open up new imaginaries and new passages that speak to the relation between life, earth, past, future, and the dead and living. So the colonial world picture was an expansive visual territory, but a cruel and violent way of seeing. It ushered in an imaginary of the world predicated on extraction and its veiling. So architecture is part of that veiling. The extractive view sees only extraction and property. It sees through other forms of life to what it can accumulate. Will the Western world mourn climate effects in Africa, on Caribbean islands, in the fire and storm of the hurricane, or in the Indonesian, in the arrival that leaves no space for adaptation? So what monuments might exist to those unequal relations? Which led us as a curatorial team to the main kind of question that underpinned our strategy. Who gets to imagine the world picture and who is marginalized by that vision? How can we begin to see differently with the knowledge of those histories, but without being contained by them and the limits of their representational concerns? So how, in short, to breathe outside the map? So I just want to pause here on the question of insurgent geologies, which have kind of, in some ways, an alternative environmental and spatial history of the world that often doesn't find its space in places like the Venice Biennale. And this is Thomas Sankara, and he said, imperialism is the arsonist of our forests and savannas. And he's talking about the way in which colonialism has completely retooled the ecologies, planetary ecologies, not just in climate, but of plants, of earth. And what he suggests is that we need to become like revolutionary architects, in re-envisaging the possibilities of architectures of repair. And so I want to kind of leave you maybe with some questions which I can pass on as a geographer to architects who actually have to engage with the building. So if we take this kind of insurgent anti-colonial geologies of resistance and repair as a kind of cartographic rendering, and if every spatial description is understood to be involved in building worlds, how might architecture of repair negotiate and name sites of operation between the geos, so geology in its expanded terms as kind of geophysics, earth, material, matter, and race? So how might it kind of negotiate these relations to build a counter cartography to normative modes of materiality? And I think we've just heard that, so in some senses that question has been answered. But if we put the question of the weaponization of geology and racial dispossession at the center of how we build those reparative descriptions, the imaginations of the earth that come from this place might look something different. So really, this is a way of asking how are questions of reparations raised architecturally? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, for leaving us with these questions and for making such a tailored presentation to the whole Triennale. And yesterday you were not here with us, but Anne-Sophie and John started sharing their reflections on the Lisbon earthquake. So somehow you were speaking to one another in parallel realms. We will now continue behind for a more informal gathering around a circular arrangement, which will be moderated by Federica Zambelletti, who is here with us, who is founder and editor-in-chief of CUSARC. Like yesterday, there will be water, there will be wine, and please join us. Thank you.